Something had shifted in Rome, subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the faint change in the wind before a storm announces itself. Nothing dramatic happened. No thunder. No grand declarations from balconies. No sudden ruptures that would shake the ground beneath St. Peter's. It was gentler than that. Quiet. Firm. Soft but unmistakably present, like the Church herself had taken a breath after holding it in for too many years. People sensed it without having to be told. Observers felt the atmosphere change before any document was released. And even the most casual Catholics, the ones who don't read Vatican press briefings or follow internal debates, could tell something in the soul of the Church had shifted direction. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. It wasn't a revolution. There were no horns. No confrontational speeches. It wasn't even a reaction to anything specific. It was more like a correction, a silent returning to center, performed with the precision of someone who understands that stability is restored not by shouting but by placing your hand gently on the rudder. And that gentle hand belonged to Pope Leo XIV. The shift began the moment he returned to Rome from his first major pastoral journey, a visit to Turkey and Lebanon. On paper, it was a short trip. In reality, it was monumental. It was the first time the world saw how Leo XIV would govern, not in theory but in motion. His words there carried weight. His silences carried direction. His gestures revealed his compass, not one aimed at pleasing factions or signaling ideologies, but one grounded in something older and far more demanding, fidelity. When he stepped back onto Roman soil, two issues that had hovered over the Church for the last decade suddenly came into focus. Issues that had created tension, debate, division, and confusion. Issues that had pulled Catholics into opposite corners, often with frustration, suspicion, and fatigue. They were the kind of topics that touched nerve endings so sensitive that even mentioning them could spark a chain reaction. And yet, Leo XIV addressed both of them within days of returning. The first was marriage. Simple. Foundational. Ancient. The kind of truth the Church had held for millennia without controversy. The kind of truth that, just a few years ago, would never have required repeating. But after years of pastoral improvisations, mixed messaging, and differing interpretations from diocese to diocese, even something this basic had become clouded. And so, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith released a statement, short, gentle, but absolute. It read, "The Church understands by the name, marriage, the union between a man and a woman." That was it. No footnotes. No pastoral disclaimers. No complex reinterpretation. Just clarity. Pure, simple clarity. For many, it felt like being able to see after staring through fog. For others, it felt like a disappointment because it did not offer the dramatic pastoral, yes, they hoped for. And for still others, especially those who wanted a complete, airtight, immutable closure, the document felt incomplete. Too gentle. Too neutral. Not decisive enough. But whether one felt relief, disappointment, or confusion, everyone could agree on one thing: the center of gravity had moved. Leo XIV had taken something fragile and placed it back on firm ground, not by force, but by breathing truth back into the conversation. The second issue he addressed, however, cut far deeper into the internal debates of the Church: the female diaconate. This issue had been the subject of 3 different commissions under the previous pontificate. Each commission contained scholars from various theological backgrounds, progressive, moderate, traditional. And all 3 reached the same conclusion: women had never received sacramental holy orders as deacons. The deaconesses of early Christianity performed important roles, but those roles were pastoral and disciplinary, not sacramental. In other words, they were not ordained. Leo XIV saw no need for a fourth commission. When 3 teams of experts all return with the same answer, reopening the debate would only feed expectations the Church could not fulfill. And so, quietly, almost casually, he made it clear that no additional study was needed. Nothing more would be added. Nothing more would be sought. He didn't slam any doors. He didn't make triumphant proclamations. He simply allowed truth to speak for itself. This, more than anything, revealed the character of his leadership. He was not a pope of extremes. He did not govern by reaction or emotion. He did not chase political points. He was stabilizing the Church on her own foundations without humiliating people who had hoped for different outcomes. Over the next several days, something unusual happened throughout the Catholic world. The tension that had filled conversations for years didn't disappear, but it softened. The Church became quieter. Not silent, but contemplative. As if everyone, bishops, theologians, priests, laypeople, was waiting to understand what this shift meant. Because it was clear that these 2 clarifications were not isolated actions. They were signals. Early outlines of a larger vision. In parishes, conversations after Mass changed tone. Instead of the usual debates about what might happen next in Rome, people talked about prayer, doctrine, and the beauty of clarity. In seminaries, young men preparing for priesthood seemed more grounded, less anxious about doctrinal uncertainty. In universities, professors adjusted their teaching not because they were instructed to, but because they sensed the Church had regained its center. Even religious communities, especially contemplative ones, felt a quiet relief. Years of turbulent interpretations had left many spiritually exhausted. Now, suddenly, it felt as though the Church could breathe again. But beneath that calm was an awareness that this stability was delicate. The Church was balanced, but the balance required strength. Leo XIV was not a pope who avoided conflict. He simply approached it with precision. He knew that clarity often awakens tension because it exposes the truth that many prefer to avoid. Peace is not the absence of disagreement. It is what happens when truth becomes firm enough to carry people through disagreement. One morning, a journalist captured a photo of Leo XIV praying alone before dawn in a small chapel, no entourage, no ceremony, just him kneeling before the Eucharist. That image spread quietly among those who follow church affairs closely. And what struck people wasn't the piety of the gesture, but the insight it gave. This was a man who draws strength from silence, from prayer, from the Eucharist, not from political maneuvering. Anyone expecting fireworks from this pope would be frustrated. Anyone expecting a vacuum of leadership would be equally wrong. Leo XIV was neither a performer nor a placeholder. He governed like a man who believed deeply that the Church must stand on truth, not noise. That the center must hold, not because it is forced, but because it is real. Over the next weeks, the peaceful tension remained. People on every side tried interpreting his direction. Some said he was undoing trends of the previous pontificate. Others insisted he was simply rebalancing the Church, not retreating. Traditionalists felt relief but stayed cautious, sensing the issues were not over, only restabilized. Progressives openly wondered what this meant for future debates about ministry, synodality, and inclusion. But Leo XIV did not play into any of these categories. He didn't govern to please conservatives. He didn't govern to appease progressives. He governed like a man who understood that truth survives not by winning battles, but by returning to its roots. In private conversations among bishops, one phrase came up repeatedly: he's not reversing anything. He's grounding everything. That became, in a sense, the secret definition of his pontificate. But the deeper question remained, what did he truly want? What was his long-term vision? People who observed him closely noticed patterns. He emphasized clarity, but not confrontation. Tradition, but not rigidity. Pastoral sensitivity, but not doctrinal ambiguity. He did not indulge emotional politics, but neither did he dismiss real wounds. He was not trying to make the church retreat into old forms, but neither was he chasing innovation for its own sake. He governed like a man who wanted the church to breathe again, truthfully, coherently, liturgically, spiritually. A church that stands on its own identity without apology or fear. And this was where the real recalibration occurred. Because Leo XIV seemed to understand something that many in the modern church had forgotten. A church that is exhausted cannot evangelize. A church that is confused cannot teach. A church that is unstable cannot be a home. So his first mission was not to change the church. It was to steady her. Not to revolutionize, but to remind her who she is. He knew that rigid things snap, but rooted things endure. His leadership was not rigid. It was rooted. Across the Catholic world, reactions were varied. Some were excited. Some were worried. Some didn't know what to think. But everyone agreed on one thing: Leo XIV was different. Not unpredictable, but quietly surprising. Not ideological, but deeply principled. Not timid, but untempted by theatrics. He was the kind of leader who could make a decisive move without turning it into a battle. The kind who could close dangerous doors without slamming them. The kind who could restore truth without breaking communion. And so, quietly, the church found herself adjusting to a new rhythm. Not a fast one. Not a disruptive one. But a firm, steady cadence, one that allowed wounds to begin healing. In the months that followed, theologians noticed something striking. Students no longer asked, "What can we get away with?" but "What is true?" Pastors noticed parishioners asking deeper questions about doctrine again. People began reading encyclicals, catechisms, and the writings of the early church fathers with renewed interest. It was as if Leo XIV's calm firmness had awakened something old and beautiful in the Catholic imagination. The change didn't come from force. It didn't come from slogans. It came from a return to clarity, a clarity that brought not rigidity, but rest. Still, everyone knew the real tests were coming: synodality, the role of the laity, liturgical debates, ecclesial identity, and the unresolved tensions that lie beneath them all. But if these early decisions were any indication, Leo XIV would not lead the church through noise or fear. He would lead through truth, and truth, spoken gently but firmly, has always shaped history more deeply than any dramatic gesture. The church, after years of divided expectations, now found herself anchored again. Not stuck. Not frozen. Anchored. And when a ship drops anchor after drifting, the first sensation is always tension. The second is stability. That is where the church stood, between tension and stability, clarity and expectation, tradition and renewal. Leo XIV had not come to wage war. He had come to steady the ship. And for the first time in a long time, Catholics around the world felt the beginning, just the beginning, of peace. Not because every debate was settled. Not because every question was answered. But because the church finally had room to breathe again. The kind of breath that lets truth shine, quietly but unmistakably, like a light that does not flicker when the wind rises. And in that quiet strengthening, something powerful began to unfold. The church, after years of noise, rediscovered her center, not by force, but by a pope who understood that truth does not need volume. It needs courage. It needs steadiness. It needs someone willing to guide without drama, without fear, without chasing applause. Someone who believes the church becomes strongest not when she fights, but when she stands firm, rooted, clear, and deeply, beautifully true. If this message touched your heart, comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.